Hello, everybody, and welcome to our channel. I'm Mark.
And I'm Rob.
And today we're going to talk about whether or not Caitlin Clark is the greatest women's college basketball player of all time. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do so. Hit the notification bell. When you do, make Rob happy. If you like Caitlin Clark, subscribe. If you like the Indiana Fever, subscribe. Simple. So, Rob, I'm going to hedge on this a little bit. I think she is the greatest player of all time because of the level of play she played the last 2 years of her career.
Okay.
If you go by the whole career, I think it's pretty close between her and Cheryl Miller and Breanna Stewart. But I maintain that in terms of her playing the last 2 years, I think she was heads and tails above everybody else in terms of how dominant she was, in terms of how much she meant to her team.
Mm-hmm.
At the heart of the discussion, of course, is the fact that she has no championships. And that has been overrated because of the media. When sports writers first started writing for MVPs, they put less emphasis on championships and what team was in first place that year. But as the media had to justify the reason for why they were voting for players for the MVP, they pointed to the standings and say, oh, that means their team wins, which of course is not correct because it depends on how much talent was on their team. So what you have to do, which is much harder to do, and it's something you have to use your imagination for, and you can't prove, but that's what you have to do. You say, how many victories would the team lose if you took that player off the team?
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no exact answer to that, but that's what you're supposed to do. And so people started just voting for the best player in the best team. It happened 17 years in a row in the NBA, for instance.
Right.
And so people put more emphasis on championships than they should. And that's in the pros. Now we're talking about the college where they only have a 4-year career. And in men's basketball, it's like a 1-year career, but they used to have 4 and sometimes 3 because freshmen couldn't play. Now, in men's basketball, it seems pretty clear. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the best college player of all time. Now, he couldn't play freshman year because that was the rule back then. But he was
Right.
3-time player of the year. He was 3-time MVP in the Final Four. He had 3 championships, and they were 88-2 in his 3 years. They couldn't do any better than that other than go, I guess, 90-0.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just a great player. So everybody doesn't seem to dispute that. But it's not just because he won 3 championships. Those UCLA teams were loaded. But he was also 3-time player of the year. So they put that together. Now, in women's, you have Breanna Stewart, who had a very similar career, but she could play her freshman year. Now, freshman year, she didn't make first, second, or third team All-American. I just want to point that out.
Okay.
She actually made first team All-American 3 years in a row, and she was player of the year 3 years in a row. She was Final Four MVP 4 years in a row, and she won 4 championships. Okay, well, that sounds like you should just give her the title. No. She played with 12 players that made the WNBA, and she was maybe the best coach in women's basketball. He's certainly the best recruiter, Gino Ariema. So she had a big advantage in terms of trying to win championships. Caitlin Clark went to a team that hadn't been to the Final Four in decades and had a bunch of 3-star recruits instead of 5-star recruits.
And that's the factor, Mark. To me, that's the factor. Like same thing with me. The great player or most valuable player is how you build up the other players. I mean, you come into the college team or your team, and you're much better than everybody else in the team. That's fine, but depending on how you are as a person or a player, do you actually make those other players better also and try to bring them up to your level? And that's what I think is a main factor.
Right. I think you were talking about the GOAT of the NBA, for instance. I use that because it's the easiest comparison because it's basketball still. Yes, if you have no championships, there's no way you're getting voted the best NBA player of all time, especially if you had a career of like 13 years or longer. And nobody is. Nobody is considered that. Everybody has at least 2 that's in the top 10, except for maybe some people might put Oscar Robertson, who has 1.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, who's generally considered the greatest player of all time, has 6. Okay, LeBron has 4, and Jabbar has 6. So they're the top 3 of the last poll by ESPN, for example.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's different. They have careers that are 13 to 20 years long. If you can't win a championship during that time period, unless you had the worst teams in the world for every year that you played, like Archie Manning in the NFL, you you should be able to drag your team to at least a couple championships if you're the GOAT. That
Right.
I have no problem with. I have no problem with that theory behind that. But it's different in college. Number one, your career is 4 years long for the women. And two, you don't necessarily have great players around you in that 4 years. You're not switching teams. You're not getting lucky with trades. You have fewer years to do it. And you didn't necessarily go to a blue chip elite program, which is what Caitlin Clark didn't do.
And nowadays, what's happening with the transfer portal, that's what happened with Cardoso. She was playing with Syracuse, and she's like, okay, maybe I want to win a championship. So she went to South Carolina,
Right.
and she ended up winning a championship with them.
So I'm going to suggest to you that championships for college team athletes are way overrated, especially in men's basketball now when they only play a year, but but in women's too, for the reasons I just gave. Also, you have to consider the level of competition you played against in the particular year that maybe you had a shot at making it. For instance, now Cheryl Swoops, she played junior college for 2 years. So it's tough to really make her the GOAT of college basketball when she played that. And she was only player of the year 1 year, but she scored 47 points in the finals and she won a championship. She dragged a team similar to what Caitlin Clark had to a championship. But when that year that she played, there was no great team. Everybody had 3 or more losses. Compare that to Caitlin Clark. She, in her junior year, the first year that she really had a chance to win a championship, they had an undefeated South Carolina team, which she beat, or Iowa beat. And then the finals, they played a team with only 2 losses. That's LSU, who had a very talented team. And they had 2 losses. They had a 2-point loss, and they lost to South Carolina, an undefeated team. So that's another strong team. She had to beat 2 strong teams in order to win the championship that year. She only beat 1.
Mm-hmm.
Cheryl Swoops didn't have to beat any really strong teams. Okay, so for people that want to point that out, because I heard that argument made by Chris Broussard, where people said, well, other people, didn't drag team to championships. She said, no, Cheryl Swoops did. And I said, okay, so I looked it up, and there was no strong teams that year.
Right.
Okay, so the next year, she had undefeated South Carolina again in the finals. And on the way there, she beat a very good UConn team who were better than their record because they had 5 injuries, and also a very good LSU team. She got revenge from the year before. In those games, Rob, she had 3 40-point games out of 6. In her 6 most important games of her career, she had 3 of the best games played in the history of women's college basketball. Name another player that did that. Nobody did that. Elite 8, Final 4 in the finals 2 years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
She played 3 great games out of 6. So to think she's not a clutch player, and there were other 3 games she played, they were probably average games on teams that were very strong that were keying in on her. So she's a clutch player, and she didn't choke in the finals. Both times she played against teams that were better than her. So this is not a participation trophy, as people say. And you don't get a chip, she's not the greatest. I don't buy that. I buy whoever's the best player. If she was on Connecticut or South Carolina or even LSU some of those years,
right,
or even stacked Tennessee teams, she could have easily won 4 championships. Would that have made her any better player? No. It just would have made her more accomplished team-wise.
right.
So I think you have to take all that in consideration, and also take in consideration is how much better do you make your teammates? Well, Caitlin Clark wins that hands down as far as I'm concerned. She's the greatest passer in the history of women's basketball, and clearly the best passer in the history of women's college basketball. And so she was an elite scorer and an elite passer. Nobody else was like that in the history of women's basketball. No one. And she meant so much to her teams in terms of trying to win. She had one person that made it into the WNBA, and she is getting a couple minutes a game right now. And that was Kate Martin. Now, Cheryl Miller, Rob and I saw play when we were younger. She was in the 1984 Olympics, and I thought she was like 1.5 times better than anybody else. And at that point, she had won 2 championships as a freshman and as a sophomore. Now, back then, they didn't have first and second team All-American. It was a Kodak All-American, and she was All-American. I'm going to assume, because she was probably the second best player in the country her freshman year, and Donovan won Player of the Year, and she won Player of the Year 3 years in a row, that she was first-team All-American for all 4 years. It's great. Caitlin Clark, according to the U.S. Basketball Writers Association, was first-team All-American 4 years in a row. The only 3 players to do that are Maya Moore, Caitlin Clark, and Cheryl Miller. No one else besides them. And the AP, she was second team. Caitlin Clark was second team All-American. How she was second team behind Dana Evans and Melissa Smith, I have no idea. Yeah. But she was first team according to the U.S. Writers Association. Now, Caitlin Clark was 2-time Player of the Year, while Cheryl Miller was 3-time, and so was Brianna Stewart. So they have that advantage over her. But I don't think Brianna Stewart or even Cheryl Miller could have dragged those Iowa teams to the finals 2 years in a row. Yeah. I don't think they could have. I don't think they meant enough to their team. When Cheryl Miller went to USC, she joined the McGee twins, 6'3", 6'4". Pam was All-American. Both times Cheryl Miller won championships. And her sister was very good too. And they also had Cynthia Cooper off the bench. So that was a loaded team when she won her 2 championships.
Right.
Junior year, they didn't do anything. Her senior year, she lost in the finals and she shot 2 for 11 in the finals. Didn't have a very good game. Now, I'm not putting Cheryl Miller down. She had great stats. She was a great all-around player. Not near the passer that Caitlin Clark is, but she had a jump shot that was about 50 years ahead of her time. And Rob and I are big fans of Cheryl Miller. And I thought she was the greatest women's player in both college or just overall in history until I saw Caitlin Clark play the last 2 years. So those are the 2 people that, I think you can make the best argument for. Maya Moore, 2 championships, and she was Player of the Year 2 times and All-American first team. So you can make an argument for her, but she went to UConn and she had a lot of great players around her. Diana Taurasi, don't even get me started. She played with 10 players that made the WNBA, and I did a whole video and I compared the stats between Caitlin Clark and Diana Taurasi, and Caitlin Clark was a better player than Diana Taurasi. You can just look at the numbers and see that. Other players that you can consider are Kamika Holtzclaw. She had 2 times Player of the Year, and she had 3 championships. But she played with 6 players that made the WNBA. And Candace Parker, now it gets kind of complicated because she was 2-time Player of the Year by 1 voting, but not by 2 other votes. She was only I call 1.33 Player of the Year because for 2 of the Player of the Years, she wasn't Player of the Year. And neither was Diana Taurasi. She was only 1.33 Player of the Year. Caitlin Clark was unanimous in all 3 Player of the Years when she was junior and senior year. So she had that advantage. So Candace Parker was not unanimous 2 years in a row, but she did have 2 championships, and she was first-team All-American twice, only twice first-team All-American. So her whole career, beginning with Caitlin Clark, Cheryl Miller, and Maya Moore had, which was first-team All-American 4 years in a row. So you have to look at all that, like how well they, and she went to Tennessee, and she played with 8 players that made it in the WNBA.
So the fact that you're trying to say is that with Caitlin Clark, which I agree with, she was only the main factor on the team, yet she built up and didn't win championships, but her style of play and the way she handled herself definitely made her one of the greatest women's college ball players because of that factor.
Right. And other players you can consider are Brittany Griner, who was 2-time Player of the Year and won a championship, and she went to Baylor. So she didn't have stacked. She played with 1 player that went in WNBA. So you can consider her. She was first-team All-American 3 years in a row, and then she was also a second-team All-American. So you can consider Brittany Griner because she didn't have stacked teams either. And like I said, she won a championship. Dawn Staley was 2-time Player of the Year, but didn't have any championships. She made it to the finals once and made it to 3 Final Fours. I don't think she was as good as Caitlin Clark anyways, but I'm just pointing her out because she was one of the players who were 2-time Player of the Years. And there was also Simone Augusta. She was 2-time Player of the Year by 2 of them, and then by 1 she wasn't. So I gave her a 1.67 for Player of the Year. But she didn't win a championship either, although she made 3 Final Fours, and she was first-team All-American 2 years in a row. So those are the players that I would consider. Diana Taurasi, like I said, had 3 championships, and she also had first-team All-American only 2 years in a row. Now, Caitlin Clark, again, was 4 years in a row. Okay, and she again, played with a lot of players. So those are the players that I would consider. Cheryl Swoops was player of the year only one time again, and she was All-American first team twice. She had one championship. So there's lots of players. I mean, we saw the whole conversation start with Jay Williams, where he said, I wouldn't even consider her great yet. And of course, Jay Billis told him he was crazy. That's silly to win a chip, because he went to a stacked Duke team and won a championship, was player of the year. So he was kind of like promoting himself for being a great player because he had a championship and a chip. Everybody said that was wrong. Okay, so being great could be like one of 25 or 50 players. And there's all sorts of players that were great that didn't win a championship. Just pointed out some to you in the women's bracket. In men's basketball, let me just show you some players who never won championships. The following players never won a championship: Larry Bird, Pete Maravich, Mark Aguirre, Kevin Durant, Blake Griffin. The next group of players never even made it to the Final Four: Tim Duncan, Wayman Tisdale, David Robinson, Glenn Robinson, Lionel Simmons, Shaquille O'Neal, Len Bias, Zion Williamson, and Hank Gathers. They never made it to the Final Four. And there's a whole long list of men's players that I could go to that didn't win a championship, all of whom are in the conversation for the greatest players of all time. That's just some. So it's silly for you to say that comment. Now it's a question of, can you be the greatest of all the time if you don't have any championships? And I maintain yes for all the arguments that I just made. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, like I said, I just think that, championships are fine, and they do factor into the player being one of the greatest, but also you have to look at the factor that how they do with their team and how they make their team, who supposedly has really not that much talent. If they can do that, to me, that's even more valuable that you can do that and actually not just build your team up to make it into a championship, or even into any kind of like finals. You bring them up, and it's not just the individual. Like I said, you pick one guy in a team, and like I had one great player, but if that player makes themselves and brings up the other players, that helps a lot.
Right. I'm gonna give you an example. Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain played in the same era, and they're both centers. And some people think Bill Russell's better, and some people think Wilt Chamberlain's better. And the ones that think that Bill Russell's better, he had 11 championships, and Wilt Chamberlain had 2, and I think they both played 13 years actually, and they played in the exact same era. And oftentimes Bill Russell beat Wilt Chamberlain in the playoffs. And I guess what I do is when I evaluate the two of them is I say, okay, let's take Bill Russell and put him on Wilt Chamberlain's teams, the same teams that he had for his career, and then take Wilt Chamberlain and put him on the teams that Bill Russell played. And do I think that Wilt Chamberlain would have won 11 championships with the teams that Bill Russell played with? No. Do I think Bill Russell would have won more than 2 championships with Wilt Chamberlain's teams? Yeah. The reason I made that analogy with Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell is I can't think of a player that I saw play women's basketball that could take the 2 teams that Caitlin Clark took to the finals 2 years in a row. That's good enough to have done that. But I can see Caitlin Clark easily winning 4 championships with stacked teams from Connecticut or Tennessee or South Carolina.
Right.
So to me, that makes her a better player. Now, let's get to her defense. Okay, so people say she's a terrible defender, which she's not. And she did take plays off with Iowa, and her on-ball defense is not good. I'll be the first to say that. Rob will be the second to say that, and Rob will be the third to say that. However, her off-ball defense is underrated and very good. Her team defense, and she's also a great defensive rebounder, which is part of defense. So yes, she's not as good as defender as some of the other players that we talked about today. So I will admit that. But it isn't that we're not aware of, it isn't that I'm not aware of her shortcomings. I am. I just think her strengths, which is the greatest passer of all time. I think she makes players around her better than anyone else in history. And she's a dual threat in both her passing and her scoring. So she contributes more offensively to her team than anyone else in women's basketball history. And I think that makes up for her defense. And so, that's the way I look at it. Now, you can argue differently, but I think it's all subjective. But that's my viewpoint of Caitlin Clark, especially the last 2 years. I think she played at a higher level than anybody else. Now, if you want to say that Brianna Stewart, or even more importantly, Cheryl Miller had a better career overall for 4 years, because Cheryl Miller was probably the second best player in the country her freshman year, and then she was 3-time player of the year. Caitlin Clark was in the top 5 her freshman year and sophomore year, and then the best player clearly her junior and senior year. So you can argue Cheryl Miller had a better overall career. So I think it's a close call, but those would be my choices for best women college players of all time: Cheryl Miller and Caitlin Clark.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't put Brianna Stewart. I don't think Brianna Stewart is as good as Caitlin Clark. I've watched them both play. She's the most accomplished player of all time, but again, she played with 12 players that played in the WNBA, and she didn't make first team All-American or second team All-American or third team All-American her freshman year, if you want to look at her whole career. But I don't really think take anything away from her. Or Candace Parker, as you can see, if you want to look at how well someone played their freshman year in the WNBA, to give you an indication how well they were actually playing at college, since it just happens months later, there's no big break. Candace Parker was MVP in the WNBA, and I could make an argument, oh, gee, she must have been really great her senior year in college, which she was. She was player of the year and won a championship.
Right. So
you can make an argument for Candace Parker. And of course, Maya Moore was great all 4 years. And she was a great player. But again, most of the players that get rated highest are all rated highest because they won championships, but most of them went to Tennessee and UConn. So just take that into consideration when you see these people saying who the best players of all time. They played with 5-star recruits. It's a lot easier to make 5-star recruits look good or to win championships with them than it is to make 3-star recruits look good or to win championships or get to the finals with them.
Right.
So that's my argument, and I'm sticking to it. And I maintain that Caitlin Clark, because of her last 2 years, is clearly above everybody else, was the greatest women's basketball player of all time, especially for the last 2 years. I guess that's what I'm going to conclude.
All right.
Rob, you have any conclusion? You have any favorite women's basketball player of all time?
Not really. Just like you said, Cheryl Miller and I think Caitlin Clark definitely.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to point out is I was listening to Chris Broussard and Nick Wright talk about this. And Chris Broussard said, well, she's the greatest women basketball player I ever saw, but she's not the GOAT because she doesn't have the championship. Why are we discounting? That doesn't make any sense logically, but why are we discounting the eye test?
Yeah.
If she's saying that because if he's saying that because he didn't see Cheryl Miller, well, I can tell you that you can go watch Cheryl Miller's championship games her freshman and sophomore year. You can watch her play also against the Russians in the Goodwill games, and you can watch her play in order for you to judge how good she was. But that doesn't make any sense to say just because she didn't win a championship, even though she looks better than everybody else. I'm using the eye test, and the eye test tells me she's the best player of all time, and I think that's totally illogical. Now, Nick Wright didn't say that. Basically, Nick Wright said, well, that's for other people to decide who's the greatest player of all time. But he agreed she's the best player he's ever seen in his entire life.
So why not?
I don't know. That makes no sense to me. And of course, Jay Williams makes zero sense to me, and he's completely wrong on that. And, you can have your own opinion on that. So, if you want to go Cheryl Miller, I don't have a problem with that. I'm just saying this championship thing is overrated for women college basketball players, especially since they have a 4-year career and because people go to blue chip programs where they play with several players who can make the WNBA and do make the WNBA. It makes it a lot easier to win a championship.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to look at your level of competition in those years, which again, Caitlin Clark had to go against two of the greatest teams of all time, undefeated South Carolina. And she beat him 1 year. So that's pretty great. So anyways, all right. That's my view. Let me know what you think. If you're a Caitlin Clark hater, you're going to say I'm crazy. If you're a Caitlin Clark lover, you're going to say, hey, that makes sense. Anyways, we're going to go live tomorrow night against the Connecticut Sun. It's at 7:30 on NBA TV. Rob and I will both be there. Our normal live show is every Monday, except for major holidays, which means we won't do it Labor Day. So our next live show is 6 to 8 Eastern time on Monday, September 9th. But we're going to do all the Indiana Fever live games. So join us for that. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that notification bell when you do. We're looking for 4,000 subscribers. And when you need your help, we do basketball and football videos. And if you like this video, hit the like button. And if you want to donate to this channel, you can with super chats and super thanks down below. And also, there's a link to PayPal. And we'll see you in the next video.
Peace out.